Subcommittee will come to order. Before I recognize myself for an opening statement, I want to take the opportunity to welcome a new member to our subcommittee. Representative John James from Michigan is with us. We're proud to have you with us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's an honor to be here.
Good, thank you. This time, the chair recognizes himself for an open statement. Ladies and gentlemen, we're here today to discuss and examine the implications of the Environmental Protection Agency's recently finalized Risk Management Program, RMP, final rule under the Clean Air Act. Thank you to our witnesses for appearing before the Environment Subcommittee today. The RMP rule will affect producers of critical materials necessary for an innovative and prosperous American economy. These include chemical manufacturers, petroleum refiners, drinking water and wastewater treatment professionals, agriculture chemical distributors, and other sectors which both make and provide a reliable supply of items necessary for improving lives, enhancing safety, and providing an affordable cost of living. Unfortunately, this RMP rule appears to be another cog in EPA's regulatory blitz, perpetuating inflation while making it harder to produce the materials and provide services Americans rely on. Managing risk is a necessary practice for doing business in heavy industrial sectors. Owners and operators invest millions of dollars into their facilities to ensure they operate safely and at maximum efficiency with proper controls. They have no interest, legally or financially, in becoming the face of industrial malpractice. Despite this inherent incentive, the Biden EPA, fueled by its ideological allies' quest for command and control, has flipped RMP on its head. In taking this step, the Biden EPA is disregarding the purpose of the statute and pursuing a zero-risk program. Owners and operators of industrial facilities already operate under a general duty clause in both the Clean Air Act and under the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. These provisions work to prevent and mitigate the consequences of accidents, as well as to furnish a workplace free from recognized hazards, which may cause or are likely to cause death or serious physical harm. In addition, the Clean Air Act clearly states the administrator shall promulgate reasonable regulations and appropriate guidance to provide to the greatest extent practical for the prevention and detection of accidental releases of regulated substances. The recent RMP rule, though, goes far beyond what is reasonable and practical for owners and operators of covered facilities. It's not reasonable for facilities to be required to disclose confidential information to anyone living, working, or spending an undefined significant amount of time within a 6-mile radius of a covered facility. In fact, it's a serious risk to our country's security. These facilities handle hazardous materials which can be exploited by those seeking to harm Americans. Nor is it reasonable or practicable for certain chemical facilities and refineries to, in place of better training, be forced to prioritize installing new physical controls or measures on their facilities every 5 years, or justify why they will not do so. And being too expensive is not a justification. Under this new RMP rule, owners and operators of these facilities must prove their safety innocence to an EPA inspector every 5 years, regardless of the inspector's technical proficiency regarding plant operations. Risk management is a serious issue. We have a duty to ensure our constituents are protected from negligence and environmental hazards. However, the pursuit of zero risk is not reasonable, nor is it practicable. Risk surrounds us every day. We drive cars to work, cross streets to get where we need to go, and take pharmaceuticals that may have potential side effects. Yet we responsibly manage these risks and reap the benefits of the opportunity they provide. The same goes for industrial production. We must responsibly manage risks to reap the benefits of the materials they provide. Today, we will explore the RMP rule to learn how it could impair the ability of American businesses to compete in the global marketplace and provide items we all benefit from. We also will hear from witnesses who are experts in the legal grounding of RMP, the field of risk management, and the hurdles businesses face when complying with burdensome regulations. Thank you, and I look forward to this hearing. I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Representative Tonko, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that the 12,000 facilities covered by EPA's risk management program make considerable contributions to our national economy, as well as the local economies of the communities that host these individual sites. But I also know that millions of Americans work at and live near these facilities, and they deserve to be able to go to work and live their lives with an adequate expectation of safety. That is why EPA's program is so important. We know that chemical fires, explosions, and releases can have serious consequences. Since its enactment in 1990, EPA's risk management program has required chemical facilities to implement hazard assessments, prevention programs, and emergency response plans. And the program has been successful. There has been a decline in incidents. But we should not forget that the rare events that still occur can have major impacts. We were reminded of this just over a year ago in former Chair Johnson's district after the East Palestine train derailment. And while that event certainly was not covered by EPA's risk management program, it is a stark reminder that chemical accidents can be incredibly dangerous and destructive. That is why we need to remain vigilant and remember the important role EPA plays regarding safeguarding the lives, health, and safety of the people working in, living near, and responding to incidents at our nation's chemical facilities. In March of this year, EPA finalized a long overdue rule to strengthen the program's requirements. The Safer Communities by Chemical Accident Prevention rule makes several important improvements to the program, and I'm proud to support it. It requires assessments of threats posed by natural hazards, such as floods and hurricanes and wildfires, which can result in damage to a facility and loss of power. As we saw during the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey in Texas, extreme weather can pose a serious threat, and when our understanding of new and emerging threats evolves, it makes perfect sense to update our practices in response. We have no problem doing this for cybersecurity. Why should natural threats be any different? Greater consideration for our changing climate and natural hazards will result in more accurate risk assessments, making facilities more resilient and providing greater protection to workers and surrounding communities. The new rule also enhances coordination with first responders, allows for greater public information sharing, and requires the assessment and adoption of safer technologies at certain high-risk facilities. This program will continue to ensure that workers receive proper training and critical information is provided to the first responders responsible for responding to an emergency. I know today we will hear from opponents of the rule who may suggest that EPA and the rule's supporters are somehow out to get chemical companies and oil refineries. I believe the exact opposite is true. The success of these businesses depends on them having a social license to operate, which means, first and foremost, they are good employers with safe working conditions, and they are good neighbors to the people that live nearby. When companies begin to cut corners and cease to take the risks posed by their operations seriously, that is when catastrophes can happen. EPA plays a critical role in preventing these catastrophes before they occur and ensuring people are prepared for the worst-case scenario. Luckily, today we will hear from a witness who has firsthand experience being trained to work at an RMP facility. Mr. Savage, thank you for being here on behalf of the thousands of United Steelworker members that make many of these facilities operate efficiently and safely. I look forward to hearing from someone tasked with representing the people that will benefit most from the protections provided in this EPA new rule. With that, I thank you, Mr. Chair, and yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize the chair of the full committee, Chair McMorris Rogers, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everyone. The United States has long led the world in innovation and entrepreneurship, while continuing to maintain the highest environmental and labor standards in the world. This leadership has not been the result of top-down government knows best. It's been the result of free market principles and an entrepreneurial spirit that is uniquely American. Our energy resources have enabled America to reduce emissions more than any other nation. This is the legacy we should be proud of and build off. Energy and Commerce Republicans have been working hard to do just that by advancing policies that protect and expand American leadership for generations to come. The Biden administration, on the other hand, has been advancing policies that threaten this legacy. These actions are putting America on a dangerous path. They're driving up inflation, killing manufacturing, and handing control of our future to China. The EPA has been the center of this agenda at a time when more than half the country is at an elevated risk of forced blackouts. The EPA has been finalizing new power plant rules that will shut down the types of electric generation needed to keep the lights on. Policies like their new PM 2.5 standards will jeopardize manufacturing and jobs across the country. There are 100 more examples of harmful policies and regulations like these coming out of Biden's EPA. When taken together, these efforts raise prices for Americans and open the door for China to replace American production and further pollute the environment. Today, the subcommittee will explore yet another of these harmful regulations, the EPA rule that will massively expand Risk Management Plan RMP program requirements. The truth is, everyone in this room wants American factories that operate responsibly and ensure communities across the country are safe. We also want those same communities to thrive and for people to have access to good, reliable jobs. Under the RMP rules, we've seen significant decrease in accidents over the past 2 decades. EPA's own data suggests that there was a 70% reduction in annual reported incidences between 2004 and 2020. And 97% of RMP-regulated facilities reported no accidents at all between 2016 and 2020. But under this new RMP rule from the Biden EPA, it will force American manufacturers out of business or force them to move their operations overseas. If the rule itself wasn't bad enough, President Biden's EPA limited the comment period, preventing the public and businesses impacted from being able to weigh in. So today, we're going to pull the curtain back and learn more about the risk of this new rule. The Clean Air Act requires RMP rules to be reasonable. And as we will discuss today, the EPA's new rule fails to meet that simple requirement. Instead, this rule will again raise gas prices for people across the country, which have already increased an average of 57 cents this year, $1.25 since President Biden took office, and in my state of Washington, they're even higher. This new rule will only add to the pain Americans are already feeling at the pump, especially as we head into the peak summer travel season. The cost of essential goods and services will also rise as a result of the changes to RMP. It will harm refineries, who will be forced to pay hundreds of millions of dollars to comply. These impacted refineries account for 40% of existing and operating U.S. refining capacity. Water utilities, manufacturers, agricultural retailers, pulp and paper products, cold storage warehouses, all could be forced to spend significant amounts of money to comply or face shutdown. Instead of undermining American economic success, let's work together to build on our remarkable legacy by embracing America's tradition of balancing economic and environmental leadership, which helps lower costs for Americans, create jobs, and will prevent us from becoming even more reliant on China. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today. I look forward to the discussion. Yield back.
Gentlelady yields. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today we're examining the Environmental Protection Agency's rule to protect America's first responders, our workers, and our frontline communities from the harms of devastating chemical accidents. With its Safer Communities by Chemical Accident Prevention rule, the Biden EPA is taking action to ensure high-risk chemical facilities are prepared to prevent disasters and mitigate the harm when accidents do occur. Nearly 180 million Americans live, work, and go to school in harm's way of a worst-case scenario chemical disaster from these facilities, including 1 in every 3 school children. Americans should not have to live in fear of a chemical explosion devastating their community, but recent examples show that we have to be prepared. Just 2 years ago, a refinery in Oregon, Ohio, had an accident release of flammable chemicals that started a fire, killing 2 workers. A fire and explosion at a chemical manufacturing facility in Crosby, Texas in 2019 caused 1 fatality and injured 28 other workers. Anyone within 1 mile of the facility was ordered to shelter in place. So these protections are necessary and long overdue. In fact, many of the requirements of the rule are already considered industry best practices, like assessing safer technology alternatives and preparing for natural disasters. The Safer Communities Rule would provide more information to communities, first responders, and workers to ensure they can adequately plan for a chemical incident. For far too long, communities have been forced to jump through bureaucratic hoops to get basic information about the critical facilities in their own backyards. And with this new rule, they will now have access to that basic information on EPA's website, ensuring they can plan and make safety decisions that best suit their household. And this structure simultaneously protects the security of the facility while giving communities enough information to make the best decisions in moments of crisis. Now, the rule also empowers workers at facilities to act to protect the safety of themselves, the facilities, and the surrounding communities. And that's important. It's a recognition by EPA that workers are the first line of defense when an incident occurs. The rule gives workers the power to issue a stop work order, and it gives them a seat at the table as processes are developed. And as we'll hear today from a 20-year veteran of a risk management program RMP facility, United Steelworkers are some of the most knowledgeable folks at a facility and can be a critical resource for protecting overall safety. Finally, EPA's strengthened RMP protections come as climate change and extreme weather worsen and present new dangers for chemical facilities and the people who work and live near them. This rule finally requires facilities to prepare for these new risks and factor the climate crisis into their safety plans. The requirements of the Safer Communities Rule have actually not even gone into effect, and yet committee Republicans are already holding a hearing to attack it. Now, it's just unfortunate, but not unexpected from this Republican majority, which repeatedly puts polluters over people. And I expect today we're going to hear, we already have, that we simply can't have safety at and around high-risk chemical facilities without jeopardizing jobs and economic growth, and that's just a false narrative, and I reject it. The history of environmental protections is proof that strong safeguards and economic growth go hand in hand. EPA has shown that with targeted investments. Agency actions routinely spur greater innovation, which grows our economy, strengthens the middle class, and makes us more competitive while also protecting public health and safety. And this is no different. Our chemical facilities should be safe, they should be climate resilient and innovative to make sure they're prepared to tackle the challenges of our growing economy for many years to come. So I'm dismayed but not surprised that Republicans want to let polluters off the hook for requirements to make chemical facilities safer. Their unfounded arguments against EPA's strengthened chemical disaster rule endangers the health and safety of workers and surrounding communities and the first responders that unfortunately must rush into a facility when an incident occurs. So EPA took a very measured and thoughtful approach on this rule, and I look forward to working with them as it's implemented. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Our witnesses for today are, first of all, the Honorable Gentner Drummond, the Attorney General for the state of Oklahoma. Mr. Drummond, thank you for being here. Mr. Jatin Shah, Senior Principal Consultant with BakerRisk. Mr. Richard Erstad, Vice President and General Counsel of Hawkins, Inc., and Mr. Jim Savage, Legislative Representative for the United Steelworkers International Union. Thank all of you for being here. We look forward to hearing you. At this time, I'll recognize Mr. Drummond for your opening statement of 5 minutes.
Chairman Carter, Ranking Member Tonko, Chairman Rogers, and Ranking Member Pallone, members of the committee, thank you for the kind invitation to be here today to address this very important topic of the Environmental Protection Agency's recent rule submission relating to risk management programs. As Oklahoma's Attorney General, I often find myself in the position of challenging rules adopted by federal agencies. During my 16 months in office, I have filed numerous actions against federal agencies, but one that I've sued more than others is the Environmental Protection Agency. Unfortunately, EPA consistently promotes policies and adopts rules that are bad for business, harmful to consumers, and outright hostile to America's oil and gas industry. The rule under review today is no exception. Adding to the regulatory burden of any private enterprise without providing sufficient corresponding benefit is a recipe for economic drag. The final RMP rule is a new burden that potentially applies to a wide range of businesses and facilities in my state and across the country. The obvious and most concerning entities are petroleum refineries and chemical manufacturers, but the list does not stop there. Chemical and petroleum wholesalers, midstream gas plants, agricultural chemical distributors, food manufacturers, and packing plants, and a wide range of other businesses that use substances covered by the new rule. As one who spent my career in private sector building businesses and growing employees, I can tell you that there is a cost to complying with any government regulation. Even regulations that policymakers and bureaucrats may believe has only a minor impact are in fact costly to businesses. The new RMP rule is far from minor. EPA estimates that it will cost in excess of $250 million annually to implement. While some may debate the actual amount of the cost, there is no debate over who ends up paying for this cost: the American consumer. As one example of how the new rule will likely result in higher consumer costs, I point out our petroleum refineries. Most refineries use hydrofluoric acid to produce higher octane gasoline. These refiners will be subject to the most stringent requirements of the rule. As any business owner can tell you, compliance costs ultimately get passed to the consumer. American drivers ultimately will pay more to fill up their tank. Because the new rule is so far-reaching, it will impact Americans of all socioeconomic classes. For instance, using chlorine to disinfect drinking water is a common practice in water treatment facilities. Under the new rule, the chlorine producer and distributor, as well as the water treatment facility, are subject to the new and costly requirements. Complying with these requirements will generate costs for all involved, to Americans who drink water. There would have to be a very substantial benefit to justify these costs, but unfortunately, the new rule provides none. It is the proverbial solution in search of a problem. By EPA's own data, it estimates that 97% of RPM-regulated facilities reported no incidents in the most recent reporting period. Further, EPA data shows that RMP incidents across all industries have declined by more than 80% between 1996 and 2022. Finally, I will address the concern that relates directly to my role as Chief Law Officer of Oklahoma. The new rule compromises the security of regulated facilities by forcing disclosure of sensitive information. The aspect of the new rule that is particularly concerning to those of us in law enforcement is that we have the duty to protect the public. The final rule simply hands over sensitive information to nearly anyone who asks. Keep in mind, these facilities often use and store very dangerous chemicals that are identified by the Department of Homeland Security as posing terrorism-related risk. This is the kind of information our federal government should guard closely, not disseminate widely. To better protect the public, this type of information should remain in the hands of those who have the skill and training to protect it and share it with their local emergency planning committees. Chairman Carter, Chairwoman Rogers, and members of the committee, I believe the new RMP rule is bad for business, harmful to consumers, and it poses a security risk to communities across this country. I will do everything I can to prevent this damaging new rule from taking effect, and I hope you will join me. Thank you.
Gentleman yields. Chair now recognizes Mr. Shah for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Carter, Ranking Member Tonko, Chairwoman McMorris Rogers, Ranking Member Pallone, and members of the subcommittee for inviting me to speak today. My name is Jatin Shah, and I am a senior principal with BakerRisk. For 35 years, I have provided risk management services to facilities and transportation workers, including those in the oil, gas, and chemical industries. As a risk consultant, I am a neutral external party helping clients identify hazards, evaluate risk, and comply with existing regulations such as EPA's risk management program. In my testimony, I highlight a number of concerns with recent changes to the RMP program. Just like everyone present in this room, I strongly believe in the safety of workers, surrounding communities, and the environment should be a top priority. These regulated facilities are safer than ever because they have collaborated with agencies like the EPA, OSHA, to harmonize regulations with industry-led standards through a public-private partnership. I understand and appreciate that the rule's intent was to improve the RMP program. However, I am concerned about how the new rule has inadvertently undermined this cooperation by creating regulatory confusion, imposing unnecessary requirements and costs, while potentially making little to no improvement in safety. This rule fundamentally alters how facilities consider safety measures. The new rule requires multiple safer technology alternatives analysis, or STAAs. A STAA is typically conducted by facilities early in the design stage of the capital project cycle, as this is the most appropriate and practical opportunity to evaluate alternate designs. Repeated STAAs are expensive studies that take time and resources from additional team of engineers and external risk analysts. It is costly and ineffective to conduct this every 5 years. The result is a very cumbersome burden that is likely to only have marginal impact on risk at best, or at worst, it may trade existing risks for unknown risks. For certain chemical and refinery facilities, this rule assumes all facilities are unsafe by mandating a one-size-fits-all mitigation requirement while ignoring any existing safety measures a facility may already have in place. EPA's own data shows that these measures have worked. Since the RMP's inception, regulated facilities have reduced incidents by more than 80%. Between 2016 and 2020, 97% of the facilities had 0 reportable incidents. This implementation requirement also unfairly singles out the 40% of the refining capacity that utilizes hydrofluoric acid, or HF, to manufacture gasoline capable of meeting our country's toughest environmental standards and specifications. HF alkylation is a safe process because it has numerous mitigation measures and is carefully managed and audited by highly trained professionals. Facilities have implemented innovative measures such as physical barriers, isolation valves, to further mitigate this risk. Since the creation of an industry-led standard called API RP 751, there has not been a single major off-site HF-related injury. Our team has done the math on how safe HF alkylation is for the general public. The chance of sustaining a fatality from the use of HF at U.S. refineries are 1 in 52 million. That is 480,000 times less likely than dying in a car wreck. 370 times less likely than getting hit by lightning and dying. This rule forces refineries to consider restructuring entire systems to switch to a financially infeasible alternative, which would likely trade very low risks for alternatives that may produce equal or greater risk. Finally, the rule's ramifications may also impact the long term. Safe facilities must submit a justification if they don't implement an infeasible mitigation measure. Many fear EPA will use these submissions to force a facility to adopt a measure or an alternative technology that is so expensive that they will have no option but to shut down. These facilities are critical to U.S. economic and energy security. They cannot operate under an untenable system where they may face costs so great they must close. While the agency intended this rule to improve the program, it has inadvertently imposed unnecessary, costly, and time-consuming analysis and requirements. I fear the results of this unfair and unnecessary regulatory burden is that some facilities may be forced to cease operations, eliminating high-paying jobs. Thank you, Chairman Carter, Ranking Member Tonko, Chairwoman Rogers, and Ranking Member Pallone, and members of the committee for the opportunity to testify today. I am happy to answer any questions you may have.
Good. Gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes Mr. Erstad for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Good morning. My name is Richard Erstad. I'm the Vice President, General Counsel, and Secretary for Hawkins, Inc. Hawkins is a specialty chemical and ingredients company that formulates, distributes, blends, and manufactures water treatment and industrial chemicals sold throughout the United States. Hawkins operates in the districts of several members of the subcommittee, and we serve water utility customers that could provide clean water to millions of Americans across the country, including many of your constituents. Hawkins is also a member of the Alliance for Chemical Distribution, or ACD. ACD represents over 440 member companies with locations in every state. ACD members provide essential products to over 750,000 end users across the country. Now, safety is of critical importance to the chemical industry. We care deeply about the safety of our employees, customers, and communities. But ACD members are alarmed by EPA's recent changes to its risk management program, or RMP. ACD members have already made significant investments to develop systems, train employees, and invest in infrastructure to meet existing RMP requirements. These existing RMP requirements have worked as designed to greatly improve safety. In fact, from 2016 to 2020, 97% of RMP-regulated facilities did not have a single reportable incident. There's no evidence of any need to change this established program, and the finalized revisions to the rules require a massive undertaking for facilities, even when they've never had an incident and diligently followed all regulations. These obligations include a requirement that some facilities undergo a safer technology alternatives analysis. This requirement is flawed. So first, when deciding whether alternatives are practical, facilities are not permitted to take into account costs or impacts to profitability, and must be done even if the facility has had no incidents. Many of these facilities produce critical chemicals used for things like water purification, meaning this requirement can ultimately force facilities to decide between operating a loss or shuttering, a process necessary for public health. Also, because the safer technology alternatives are often newer technologies or strategies, they can be a departure from recognized and generally accepted good engineering practices, or GREGAGEP. This is concerning as facilities will be required to adopt newer alternatives in place of REGAGEP processes that have been established and verified. Another alarming aspect is the extensive new information sharing requirements. The regulation now requires facilities to supply individuals who live, work, or spend significant time within a 6-mile radius with information related to the facility's chemicals and processes. In conjunction with this requirement, the EPA has created a risk management public data tool, a public website that displays sensitive information on all RMP facilities to anyone around the world with computer access. This creates immense security concerns for chemical facilities, as this information is sensitive and puts them at risk for being targeted by malicious actors, especially in the light of the expiration of CFATs. But the website does not fulfill the requirements of the RMP rule. For example, in some cases, facilities must also supply information in at least 2 other commonly spoken languages. One Hawkins facility is located in Black Hawk, South Dakota, where there's a large Lakota population. Translating the nuanced technical jargon of these documents into Lakota would be a difficult and costly endeavor. Lastly, the EPA establishes broad third-party audit requirements in this rule, applying it to many more facilities, greatly restricting who can serve as auditors. These auditors must be external and have certain credentials, adding additional burdens on facilities because it can be difficult to find technically qualified individuals who understand the complexity of the processes. The EPA does not consider that process-specific expertise is often critical. The credentials required in this rule are broad, allowing auditors to evaluate systems they may not have any experience with. It's also important to consider that these changes come as the EPA is implementing other regulations, such as the Clean Water Act hazardous substance facility response plans, several new regulatory rules under the Toxic Substance Control Act, new air emissions reporting and control measures, and this places a significant cumulative impact on facilities, driving up costs and making it more difficult to provide the necessary chemicals on which communities and citizens across the country rely. The new revisions to the RMP program are not necessary and establish new onerous burdens on facilities when the vast majority do not have incidents and have extensive procedures in place to prevent incidents from occurring. Instead, the EPA should focus on enforcing the current regulations, providing guidance to assist facilities, and punishing bad actors who do not meet their regulatory obligations. I appreciate the opportunity to represent ACD's views and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Gentleman yields. Chair now recognizes Mr. Savage for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Carter, Ranking Member Tonko, members of the committee, good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Jim Savage, and I'm a legislative representative for the United Steelworkers International Union. We're the largest industrial union in the United States. We represent the majority of organized workers in the petrochemical industry. I doubt there is another union that represents more workers impacted by the risk management program than USW. Safety regulations are not written in ink on paper. They're written in the blood of the workers who have been killed and maimed in preventable accidents on the job. My own background is in the refining industry. I worked in the South Philadelphia Energy Solutions refinery for 27 years. The saddest but most important part of testifying about this issue is that we must discuss and learn from past disasters. On June 21st, 2019, I was finishing up a 12-hour night shift, looking forward to having the coming weekend off. At 4 a.m., an emergency response alert went out over the radio. It was a report of a leak on our hydrofluoric acid alkylation unit, HF. Any loss of primary containment in an oil refinery has the potential for catastrophic consequences, but none more than HF acid. Within seconds, we felt the concussion of the first explosion. I ran to the door of the blockhouse to see what we were dealing with, and when I opened the door, my entire field of vision was consumed by a massive ball of fire. This was quickly followed by a second explosion, and we immediately went to work securing our own unit, when about 15 minutes later, the third massive explosion happened. We were certain there would be multiple fatalities. I gathered my crew and told them the unthinkable, that they should call their wives, because I knew if we had a major release of HF, we were unlikely to survive. You can't outrun a vapor cloud. Some period of time passed before an announcement was made that, unbelievably, but thankfully, all the workers were accounted for. Make no mistake about it. The immediate and heroic response by the operators on that unit saved our lives and likely thousands of lives in the surrounding community. The fires raged for over a day before being classified as under control. Within days, PES declared bankruptcy and announced that the refinery would be shut down. I would refer you to my written testimony for some other examples. Recently, EPA issued the Safer Communities by Chemical Accident Prevention final rule after more than a year and a half of stakeholder engagement and input. Everybody had an opportunity to have their say. Lasting and meaningful reform of the risk management program has been a priority for our union for nearly 2 decades. The critical importance of the rule in protecting workers and communities cannot be overstated. It plays a pivotal role in preventing chemical disasters. Some elements of the rule that we support include identification and prevention of hazards. One prevention effort is the inclusion of stop work authority. Without this provision, workers are faced with a choice of risking their life or their livelihood when confronted with dangerous work. While many companies say their employees have the authority to stop performing unsafe work, the ability and authority to shut down a process operating in unsafe conditions as opposed to stopping an unsafe job task is often met with fierce opposition and threats of being fired. I would refer you again to my written testimony for some of my own personal experience with stop work authority. We also support the emergency preparedness and response provisions, the public transparency and accountability positions, and I expand on these also in my written testimony. In conclusion, the risk management program is not merely a bureaucratic requirement. It is literally a lifeline for workers, families, and their communities. Safe facilities save jobs. Safe facilities save lives. Safe facilities save communities. In fact, USW believes that while this rule is an improvement over what was existing, it still has plenty of room for more improvement. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Gentleman yields. Thank all of you for your opening statements. We'll now begin questioning, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Drummond, in my opening statement, I discussed how the EPA's risk management program's final rule exceeds statutory authority and goes beyond what I would consider to be reasonable and practical. Some would argue that the heavy mandates and the use of vague terms in the federal regulations issued by this administration, as well as their enforcement, are designed to create a punishing environment for disfavored industries rather than even-handedly enforcing our laws. Mr. Drummond, from what you've seen in Oklahoma, would you agree or disagree with this statement, and why?
I would certainly agree with your statement, Mr. Chairman. It's hard enough for a business in any industry to comply with the clearest and simplest of government mandates. And I know that industry leaders subject to the rule will want to comply, and they will do everything that they can to comply with the current rules. However, the rule as proposed is both vague and it's preventative in its terms, that we'll see that certain businesses and industries exposed to enforcement action, even though they have made every effort to comply. Another problem I would point out is the vagueness and that it's bound to increase costs. And those who wish to play by the rules inevitably will do more and spend more to comply. As I said previously, these costs ultimately will be passed on to consumers.
Good. I'm also concerned that these abuses of the statute are an attempt to co-opt RMP into a zero-risk program, something that was not created to be. Mr. Shah, in your opinion, is a zero-risk a feasible regulatory pursuit? Microphone.
Thank you, Congressman Carter. Achieving zero risk is not a practical option from a regulatory perspective or from any perspective, because the only way you get to zero risk is by not performing the activity.
Well, if we kind of expand upon that, can you explain the importance of consequence and probability in properly assessing risk?
Yeah, so let me use the example of crossing the street. We all cross streets, and the consequence of crossing a street is potentially getting hit by a vehicle and dying. The probability of that happening depends upon where we cross that street and what's happening on that street, right? So if I'm crossing a residential street and I cross in the middle of the street, I have a higher probability of getting hit than if I cross at a crosswalk at the corner. If I cross at a crosswalk that has a light that tells me when to cross that crosswalk, walk or do not walk, then my probability of getting hit drops even further. If I build a pedestrian bridge across that street to cross, my probability of getting hit by a car drops to zero. But my risk hasn't completely gone away, even with the pedestrian bridge. I've transferred that risk to something else, which is that pedestrian bridge could collapse, and the person driving underneath that bridge, if that collapses on them, they could die from that accident. So I've not eliminated risk to zero in that situation either.
And I have to agree with you, and I'm not trying to mix apples and oranges here, but I'm a pharmacist, and I was a consultant pharmacist in a nursing home, and one of the questions we always ask about medications was the benefit outweigh the risk, and often the benefit does outweigh the risk, so I couldn't agree with you more, and I appreciate that. We all know, Mr. Erstad, that RMP rules must be reasonable. And we all have a different definition of reasonable. I understand that. But in practice, do you think as a regulated entity, do you think the regulation is reasonable?
I mean, I think, from a business perspective, we look too at that cost-benefit analysis. And obviously, we want to be in compliance, and safety is critical. We definitely want that. But I think in light of these rules, we have a hard time seeing the benefit that comes from them. And there is certainly a cost associated with them, and I think it would be helpful if we understood the true benefit coming out of them.
Can you cite any in particular and to give us an example?
Well, I think that, I talked a little bit about this safer technological alternatives analysis that we have to go through that, we're already doing Reg-A-Gep, we're already doing what we believe are industry standard practices, and that's what we want to do. We don't want to add, I think as Mr. Shah said, additional risks that are not otherwise anticipated.
Okay. Thank you all again for being here, and I'll now recognize the ranking member, Representative Tonko, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Savage, I want to thank you again for being here. You provide important insights as someone who worked at an RMP facility for many years, and you lived through a pretty harrowing experience. Can you share with members a little more about what that was like. How was it to tell your fellow coworkers, as you indicate, to call their loved ones because there was a chance the worst could happen?
Thank you, Mr. Tonko. I've worked in the refinery for 27 years, and you don't work in a facility like this for 27 years without running into some hairy situations now and then throughout your career. But there's nothing that could ever prepare you for what we experienced in Philadelphia at 4 a.m. on June 21st of 2019. It was equivalent of like a nuclear bomb, and it was about 300 or 400 yards from us. We felt the heat, the concussion knocked us back. My coworker, the color drained from his face, and he was getting ready to sort of pass out. And I grabbed him and sat him down, got him some water. But, you know, telling your coworkers, I was the head operator on the crew, like we had to secure our unit because when one unit has a problem in a refinery, there's upstream and downstream effects. So we were running around trying to get that, and I gathered everybody. I thought, we're not going home this morning. So, like, guys might want to call your wife. 4 in the morning, wake her up, tell her you love her, because I don't think we're getting out of here. As it turned out, ironically, the force of the explosion itself had consumed so much of the HF that was released that we were able to go home, thankfully. But it's a life-changing experience. And over 1,000 direct jobs gone, very good, well-paying jobs, family-sustaining jobs, another 18,000 indirect jobs impacted, tax base of the city of Philadelphia impacted, small businesses that relied on our refinery impacted. So, you know, it just, that's my answer.
Yeah, well, I thank you for sharing that because I can imagine it's most difficult. I understand these jobs inherently have some risks, but those risks can be mitigated through a variety of methods, including having well-trained employees. That is why this program is so important. It helps ensure that employers are taking steps that make it more likely that people get to go home safely at the end of their shifts. One of the ways this new rule helps protect and empower workers is through its stop work authority, so people can take control if they see an incident about to occur. Mr. Savage, can you explain the new stop work authority that EPA has given workers in the final RMP rule?
Yes, thank you. As I said in my remarks, you know, I've had, it's been our experience as a union, every employer will say our employees have the right to stop unsafe work. But there's a difference in how that is handled in the real world, whether it's actually stopping just an unsafe job task, like getting the proper sling to pull a pump or something like that, and shutting down a process that is operating in an unsafe condition. I had a situation one time about 10 years ago. We had heater piping that was leaking, and the portion of piping that was leaking was under insulation, so we couldn't determine the severity of the leak. I was the head operator on the unit, as I said, and I informed the operations manager, we're going to have to pull the feed on this unit and shut it down so we can figure out what we're dealing with here, so we don't have a catastrophic release. And immediately my job was threatened. He looked me right in the eye and he said, you do that, you know what happens next. And it took over an hour of pretty spirited debate and continuous threats to my job before eventually a responsible engineer stepped up to the plate and said, I think we need to pull the feed and shut this unit down. But I was a local union president of a local union with a pretty well-earned reputation for aggressive health and safety advocacy. And I was under a tremendous amount of pressure during that situation. Imagine what somebody in a facility without the protections of a collective bargaining agreement would go through. I doubt that they would be able to stand their ground.
Thank you. Well, workers are on the front lines at chemical facilities and are the experts in how these facilities operate, so reducing risk at these facilities should mean empowering workers to make those safety decisions without any fear of retaliation. So appreciate your comments here this morning. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Weber, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Attorney General, I'm going to come to you. I'm the Upper Gulf Coast of Texas, 14th District. 7 ports, more than any other member of Congress. We produce 65% of the nation's jet fuel, 80% of the nation's military-grade fuel. So we are huge, huge, huge on energy. LNG plants, 2 already on the ground, 1 up and running, and 1 over in that other foreign country, Cheniere Energy over in Louisiana. So I assume you have a law degree. Okay, good. Good to know. We understand that the EPA has been seeking waivers from the Department of Justice to exceed the cap in civil penalties demanded for violations. I'm going to make a couple of points, and then I have a question for you. In your opinion, doesn't that shouldn't Congress have the purview and have some say-so in this, that the EPA should not just be allowed to run amok in this situation?
Certainly, Article 1 vests this body the ability to write laws and amend laws, and Article 2 provides the executive branch to implement those laws. In this instance, the EPA is pretending to be the Congress.
And I appreciate that insight. So normally this waiver only happens for the largest and most capitalized firms, but the EPA is now seeking it to go after medium and small-sized businesses. Have you experienced, I know you said you've been there 18 months, but I'm sure you grew up and you're paying attention. Are you aware of such a waiver has been sought for medium or small-size operators in Oklahoma?
As of this date, none in Oklahoma yet.
None yet. Keep your fingers crossed.
All right, we anticipate it.
Yeah, I hear you. So considering this administration and its political allies are trying their best to eliminate fossil fuels and the risk management program known as RMP, and the oil and gas sector are 2 targets of that, is there anything y'all think there in Oklahoma you can do to help these entities from over-the-top, non-commensurate prosecution by the EPA, again, which exceeds Congress, which is trying to usurp Congress's authority? Anything y'all can do for that?
The oil and gas industry will affect everyone in this room and those that can hear this testimony for the rest of our lives. It is not going to be replaced in any short order, and it is a shame that this industry is a target. As I mentioned in my testimony, my office has joined several comment letters and lawsuits about rules targeting the oil and gas industry, and I think that it is important to have fair rules and consistent enforcement. Anything beyond that is abusive, and I will do everything in my power to push back.
Well, thank you for that. I spent 4 years in the Texas House before I got demoted to Congress, and I was on the Environmental Reg Committee. And when an explosion happened in one of the plants, one of our friends across the aisle, Democrats, said, well, they just don't care about safety. They don't care about their employees. And I said to her, listen, that's not true. Those people work together. Those people, she said, all they do is care about the bottom line. And I said, you think about what you're saying. Because when they have an explosion like that, now you're going to bring in OSHA, you're going to bring in the authorities, you're going to maybe penalties and fines, everything stops. These people live and work in that area. Their kids go to school together. They play t-ball together. They want a safe environment. They do everything they can to make this environment safe. I'm concerned about the sensitive information about these facilities that anybody can get. Are you following what we call the debacle of the Biden administration? Because the open border is, and we know that there are terrorists in this country from foreign nations that hate us, and I can go down the list: Syria, Iraq, Iran, all the way down the list, Yemen. Should we be concerned about the risk that some of those would get this information and use it to their advantage against us?
Certainly, as the chief law officer of Oklahoma, my greatest concern about this rule is that it exposes this sensitive information to clearly the residents and the businesses, but also tourists and terrorists. There is the rule is too vague to protect sensitive information, and it exposes us to terrorist activity in our homeland.
And Counselor, you're making the point that Congress, should be having this debate, this discussion, how we view this, how we want to proceed, what safeguards may be in place, what risks there are. Not some bureaucrat division, and I shouldn't say this, but by people who, many of them had never really had a job in the real world. They grew up maybe going to colleges and thinking they want to protect Mother Earth, which I call the new religion. And so y'all are going to be on top of that in Oklahoma. Glad to hear that. Mr. Shah, with about 20 seconds, you stated that you, in your testimony, the facilities are already implementing extensive analyses. Give us examples in about 10 seconds.
These facilities are already doing audits, risk management analysis, risk assessments, and mitigation systems. They all have those in place to comply with the existing requirements of RMP and PSM.
And it's your experience they do that to protect people and their bottom line concurrently?
Yes.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone from New Jersey, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Facilities covered by EPA's risk management program use or store large amounts of highly toxic or flammable chemicals that pose a risk to Americans. And the purpose of the program is to reduce chemical risk in the event of an accidental release, especially for those living and working in and around chemical facilities. Unfortunately, the threats to these facilities are increasing as climate change makes extreme weather more common, and RMP facilities have been impacted by hurricanes, floods, and wildfires, putting us all at risk. So to that end, the Safer Communities by Chemical Accident Prevention Rule added a new requirement for facilities to consider and plan for extreme weather and climate change in their risk management plans. And the recent flooding across Texas, a state with a high concentration of RMP facilities, drives home the importance of this new requirement. So I wanted to ask Mr. Savage, if you will, how has extreme weather increased the vulnerability of chemical facilities, if you will?
Thank you for your question. I think that the main thing that I've observed in the Philadelphia refinery even was the lack of infrastructure for stormwater removal and things like that. And the more extreme and severe weather events that we would have, the refinery would flood. I would refer you back to Hurricane Harvey, as was mentioned, the Arkema facility in Crosby, Texas, which was inundated and you know, was a complete disaster. So I think that it needs to be recognized, it needs to be taken into account, and the facilities need to prepare as best they can to deal with it.
So you would agree that that requiring chemical facilities to assess the risk posed by climate change is important. You agree with that?
I would say if they're not assessing that risk, they're not responsible enough to operate the facility.
Well, thank you. So I agree. And as we experience 100 and 200-year flood events more often, facilities need to plan for worst-case scenarios to make sure their infrastructure can hold up. But another topic I want to discuss is the DHS's companion program to EPA's risk management program, and that's the Chemical Facilities Anti-Terrorism Standards, also known as CFATS, within the Department of Homeland Security. And while the House was able to pass a bipartisan extension last year, unfortunately, the program lapsed in July. And for over 9 months, Senate Republicans have held up a clean reauthorization of the Department of Homeland Security Oversight Program. So right now, EPA is the only agency urging chemical facilities to engage in safer practices in conducting any oversight. So let me go back to Mr. Savage. I know you're a 20-year veteran of a chemical facility. How important is EPA's RMP program to managing risk at large-scale chemical facilities, particularly in the absence of a program like CFATS?
Thank you. It is important, and all the other regulations that are mentioned, you know, OSHA, process safety management, whatever. You know, when I got hired into the oil refinery in the early 90s, OSHA had just implemented the process safety management standard, and industry people were like apoplectic that this was going to shut down facilities, and the compliance costs were going to be and not worth the benefit, and all that. I don't think you could find any serious person today that would say that we shouldn't have the process safety management standard. You know, like this is kind of the same old arguments that get recycled every time a requirement to run facility safe is proposed.
I mean, just you can just say yes or no you want. I mean, because we don't have the CFATS program, does that mean that the EPA's RMP program is even more important?
Yes, I agree. And the Steelworkers supported a reauthorization of CFATS.
All right. Thank you so much. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the vice chair of the committee from Pennsylvania, Dr. Joyce, for 5 minutes of questioning.
First, I want to thank Chairman Carter for holding today's important hearing on the new proposed role for EPA's risk management program. It should go without saying that safety is a bipartisan issue. Members on both sides of the aisle in this committee believe in protecting workers and communities from dangerous chemical exposures. That is why we need to start by recognizing how successful our industries have become at minimizing the risk of accidental releases. American industry is the safest and the cleanest in the world, and it continues to invest in new technology to make things better each and every year. Despite the good intentions of this latest EPA action, I have serious concerns about the effects that this rule would have on our economy and on our constituents. First, we cannot afford to cripple our refining industry. Hydrofluoric alkylation refining units make up half of Americans' refining capacity. Forcing them offline would quickly lead to higher prices at the pump, which Americans can't afford. Second, the overbearing regulatory burden that this puts on chemical manufacturers will stifle an industry that is critical for the United States to compete in 21st century manufacturing. Lastly, I am worried that this rule makes safety the enemy of security. While there are times when it is important to publish what chemicals that facilities manufacture and store, the reporting requirements in this rule make it far too easy for bad actors to have access to the sensitive information that they so desperately want. There is a reason Congress created the Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Standards Program, CFATS, in DHS. And EPA's risk management program is no replacement for the CFATS program. My first question is for you, Attorney General Drummond. As you and Chair Rogers mentioned earlier, your state has specific concerns about chemicals given its history. As your state's top law enforcement officer, does this make your job more difficult?
It certainly will. We have identified Chinese syndicated crime organizations inside the state, standalone cartels. It would take very little effort for these organized bad actors to have access to chemicals that would then create terroristic threats on our homeland, and we can't stand for that.
Mr. Erstad, your members supply everyone from pharmaceutical companies to farmers. In this role, how has the EPA increased the vulnerability of your members, and can give specific examples?
Well, I cited one of the ones that concerned us, the industry, a lot was when we saw the website that now gives the GPS coordinates of every facility in the country that has chlorine gas, for example. And that's something that's accessible to anybody around the world. I think that there's the people living, working, or spending significant time within 6 miles issue is a real nebulous issue for us to understand, because how are we supposed to prove that? I've seen things where the EPA suggested that we're supposed to look at pay stubs or something else to see if they're actually legitimate questions. After 9/11, we took a different approach with this information, and that was something that was available in the reading room here. It's available to the public. You'd have to show your ID, but it was controlled. And I think that the concern from the industry perspective is this information now being more widely disseminated. The industry is going to have to decide who should have access to this and who shouldn't. We're going to have to be the ones deciding this, and if we decide wrong, we're going to get in trouble for doing that. So we struggle with that portion of the rule.
Mr. Erstad, based on witness testimony and information regulated stakeholders have sent to our committee, it seems clear to me that there are serious concerns about the increased costs, the compliance uncertainty, the lack of auditors, and the major paperwork requirements. What redundancies with other requirements were created with this new RMP rule?
Well, I think that there are a lot of things that are already covered. I think the RMP rules, even when we talk about some of the issues with looking at worst-case scenario planning, we tried to do that before. We were looking at natural disasters. We were looking at backup power, because that's something you should be thinking about with a facility if you're running it responsibly. And I think that a lot of this is a blanket approach that doesn't take into account companies that have been doing a good job, doing the best practices to begin with, and now we're adding additional layers of regulation and complexity when industries, and basically punishing industries that are already doing a good job.
I think this blanket approach could potentially be smothering. Mr. Erstad, in name of increased safety, what risk trade-offs are being made concerning our domestic supply chain?
Well, anytime you add cost, you could drive people out of business, and that could reduce the availability of the product. So,
Thank you. My time has expired. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Colorado, Ms. DeGette, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I've long been an advocate for the EPA to issue strict safety measures at chemical plants because of the proximity of residents who live right there on the fence line and, of course, the workers who work in these plants. In my district, we have an area, Globeville, Elyria, Swansea, in North Denver, which is bordered by a huge refinery, the Suncor refinery, and it emits harmful toxins into the surrounding community. So I've been working for many years with the EPA to try to implement inherently safer technologies to mitigate or even eliminate the risk hazardous chemicals posed to these communities. In the EPA's final rule for RMP, they included a version of inherently safe technologies called Safer Technology Alternatives Assessments. While it's less than in the original proposal that would have included all RMP facilities, the EPA decided to prioritize high-risk facilities, which constitute 10% of the overall RMP facilities that are covered. So these facilities, these 10%, are going to have to look at their covered chemicals and processes and to identify at least one passive way to make the processes safer. So unfortunately, the witnesses who are here today say that the cost of this safety measure does not justify the benefit. I disagree, and I think the safety and lives of workers, first responders, and environmental justice communities account for a large benefit. So I want to ask you a couple questions about this, Mr. Savage. Does the safety of your fellow workers and the surrounding community demonstrate a significant benefit to you versus the cost of assessing technologies?
Thank you. Of course.
Yeah.
Of course. I think that it's overlooked that, and I would say that this it doesn't necessarily apply to all of our employers. Some of them are very responsible.
Of course.
But the ones that aren't, they're creating problems in the community. It's going to cost us our jobs. Once the community, I think somebody mentioned earlier about the social license of operating these facilities. Once you lose the community, that's it.
Right.
You're not going to be able to operate that facility.
That's right. Now, how can the shifts in the amounts of chemicals on a site or a change to the safety processes at a plant really make the job at chemicals facilities much safer for those on the job?
I'm sorry?
How can companies make the safety at a plant safer by simply changing the amount of chemicals or changing the safety processes that they use?
I think that, it depends on the facility and what substances and processes they're using, but I think that they should be constantly evaluating on how to do things safer, how to keep the workforce safe, how to keep the community safe.
So one of the things that your colleagues here have been talking about all day, they're really worried, they say, about more disclosure of chemicals. But we've seen emergency after emergency happening around the country. We've had some also in Colorado where we have extreme weather, climate change, aging infrastructure, et cetera, where we have a chemical release, and the first responders and the others going in, they don't know what chemicals are at that facility. And that's why we're trying to have more robust disclosure. Do you think that that's an important goal that we should strive for, Mr. Savage?
Yes, ma'am. I would say that when it comes to members of the community have an absolute right to know what dangerous substances and processes are being operated near their homes. And when communities feel safe, they're less likely to oppose new facilities, new processes, new jobs, right? So it's a win-win.
It's like if they don't want to disclose what's there, it makes people paranoid about what's there, right?
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay, I yield back. Thanks.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Representative James, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Honorable members of the House Energy and Commerce Committee Subcommittee on Environment, Manufacturing, and Critical Minerals, and esteemed witnesses, I appreciate the opportunity to speak as we convene to address the vitality of our manufacturing sector. This rule, published on March 10th, 2024, marks a significant juncture in our nation's approach to chemical facility safety and emergency preparedness. The EPA's amended RMP regulations, while aiming to enhance process safety and public awareness of chemical hazards, could inadvertently burden Detroit's auto painting and plating industry with additional compliance costs. These changes may impede the industry's ability to operate efficiently and competitively, potentially impacting jobs and economic growth in the region. The voices of industry stakeholders, like those in Detroit's auto paint and metal plating sectors who are affected by this rule, must be heard and considered in shaping policies that promote safety while fostering economic growth. Let's engage in a constructive dialogue and collaborative efforts to address the challenges ahead, ensuring that the interests of the American people and our manufacturing industries are safeguarded. I don't believe it does us any good to insinuate the other side either does not care about economics or does not care about people. In fact, I believe it detracts from the conversation. As we scrutinize the final rule promulgated by the EPA, we must ask ourselves, does the rule adequately fulfill our obligation to protect the American people and support American manufacturing? I, representing Michigan's 10th Congressional District, the #1 manufacturing district in the entire nation, this is critical to the people who sent me here. So let's start with Mr. Shah. The refining industry accounts for less than 1% of the total hydrofluoric acid releases, yet this rule seems to focus on imposing burdensome regulations specifically hitting this industry. In your role as a risk analyst, how does the risk, in your opinion, at HF refineries compare to those other risks we take each day by, as you mentioned, stepping outside for a walk, handling knives, or driving a vehicle?
Thank you, Congressman. As I had said in my testimony, the chance of dying from an HF release at a U.S. refinery is 1 in 52 million. That is 800 times lower than a bee sting, dying from a bee sting. It is 1,700 times lower than dying from a sharp object like a knife, or 13,000 times less likely than dying from a bicycle accident. And I already said 480,000 times less likely than dying in a car accident. It's unbelievably low risk already. And the reason for that, the reason for it being that low is because of the layers of mitigation measures that have already been taken into account by these industries to protect and make sure that that HF unit operates safely.
Thank you, Mr. Shah. We know how potent appeals to emotion and scare tactics are, but we have an obligation to balance impact with probability. Thank you for your opinion on sharing here. Oklahoma Attorney General Gentner Drummond. Today we have heard how the RMP rule treats well-operated plants the same as poorly run plants, requiring them to upgrade their facilities every 5 years regardless of cost or performance. We see this all the time with overregulation, one-size-fits-all approach. Assuming these businesses want to continue to legally operate, I'm guessing the rational business response is to pass these costs along. What are your concerns from a consumer protection standpoint that this rule will bring to your constituents in Oklahoma? And also, what do you believe is the natural second and third order effects of not being able to do this safely in the United States?
Right, so I think that the existing rule has illustrated that in the last reporting period, 97% of the RMP regulated facilities did not report an incident. So we already have a rule that is establishing that. And now to increase that regulatory burden will drive costs up. It will also have a natural consequence of increasing citizen suits against industries that are already performing well, therefore distracting energy and resources to defend these suits without any reasonable likelihood of the citizen suit prevailing. So I think in every measure of the word, this proposed rule adds burden to the American consumer with no defined benefit.
Thank you, General Drummond. Mr. Chairman, I'm from the Great Lakes State. We deeply, deeply care about clean air and clean water, and we deeply, deeply care about working men and women and our first responders. We must do our best to take a balanced approach to serve all Americans. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Dr. Ruiz, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you. I proudly represent California's 25th Congressional District, a community where summer temperatures frequently surpass 100 degrees Fahrenheit. In July 2023, a year that marked historic peak in temperatures, the Coachella Valley in Southern California endured 19 days where temperatures exceeded 112 degrees Fahrenheit. And similar to many regions across the nation, the communities I represent witnessed the effects of climate change firsthand. We endure more intense and frequent scorching heat waves and devastating wildfires, serving as undeniable indicators of a shifting climate. Rising temperatures, intensified storms, and unpredictable weather patterns are endangering our infrastructure, particularly our chemical plants and refineries. And these facilities are vulnerable to flooding, extreme heat, and storm surges, which can result in accidents, toxic releases, and spills. The ramifications extend well beyond the perimeters of these industrial sites, endangering the health and safety of workers, neighboring communities, and our ecosystems. Mr. Savage, based on your experience, when an incident occurs, does it remain contained within the confines of the facility, or does it extend into the surrounding community?
Thank you. We don't work under a dome. So a fence doesn't keep vapor clouds contained inside a facility. So yes, it has community impact.
So these chemical disasters not only impact families and communities, but also exacerbate air quality. They release hazardous chemicals into the atmosphere, resulting in immediate and long-term consequences, including respiratory ailments, cardiovascular diseases, and ecological harm. Mr. Savage, in your experience, does the community usually have hours of time to prepare ahead of an incident so they can get their kids out of school, pack up, and leave the area before it happens?
No, they have seconds.
They have seconds. And how is the community informed usually?
In Philadelphia, we had a community alert system. We had a siren that would go off. And there was some sort of community alert system set up. But if I recall correctly, on the morning of June 21st, 2019, the company never informed the community of anything. They were informed of the explosion when they were knocked out of their beds by the force of it.
And how long did it take the community to start mobilizing after that?
There was press conferences that morning while my coworkers were still fighting the raging fires, demanding that the refinery be shut down. People had reported respiratory issues. In fact, there's, I think, 56 zip codes in the city of Philadelphia, and the highest per capita rate of childhood asthma was the zip code that contained our refinery. So I don't necessarily know that the owner of our refinery was a good neighbor to begin with, but that explosion was the end of any chance of that.
And so what do you think about the shelter-in-place orders after these spills? Could they be more harmful for the residents to be, and the workers to be sheltered in place?
I think that would depend on the circumstances of the particular incident. In some cases, it may be appropriate. In some cases, it could be more harmful. What you hope is that there's good emergency response plans, and this has all been thought of beforehand, so that when these things happen, people have a way that they know how to handle it.
And so that's what the EPA rules do. In fact, they force the facilities to come up with plans beforehand and to coordinate with the community, correct?
That's correct.
And that would be helpful in order to have a more streamlined response in case there is a spill, correct?
We support that, yes.
You know, the whole idea here is that to actually make improvements so that accidents don't happen with upgrades in technology and hazard mitigation efforts in the high-risk facilities, correct?
Yes, I agree.
Okay, well, I agree with those sentiments for the sake of our workers and the surrounding communities. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Balderson, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here today. My first question is for Mr. Erstad. Mr. Erstad, first of all, thank you for the great work that you do and the jobs that you provide in the great state of Ohio, and more importantly, at the Galena facility, which is in the 12th Congressional District, so thank you very much. Power demand is estimated to increase substantially in the coming decades. In fact, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation's most recent long-term reliability assessment shows that power demand in North America is growing at the fastest rate in over 30 years. Meanwhile, the EPA just finalized rules that will place unachievable regulatory mandates on power providers and drive existing reliable generation off the grid and into early retirement. Mr. Erstad, since we're discussing safety and risk with the RPM-covered facilities, I'm curious, would you risk at Hawkins facilities be increased with rolling brownouts and unanticipated electricity outages?
Well, obviously, unanticipated events are something we need to mitigate and work to, limit the effects of. We believe we already do. I think that the effects of power short outages are going to affect deliveries to consumers, to our customers, and potentially a supply chain. But we believe under our existing processes and our existing review under the RMP that we are controlling the risk to the general public, but there certainly is a risk to the supply chain.
Okay, thank you. Follow up to you again. In your testimony, you raised concerns about the third-party audit criteria. You make the point that under this rule, the auditor who lacks specific technical expertise could ultimately make processes less safe. Could you elaborate on this and provide an example if possible?
Well, there's a lot of different chemicals or processes. Our primary processes and primary chemicals we handle are chlorine. We take chlorine in, comes in by a rail car, and we make bleach out of it, largely. In some cases, we repackage it into cylinders that we then haul to water treatment facilities across the country to purify the drinking water. If you have somebody, there are certain chemical compatibilities, certain types of steel, certain, the gaskets that are used in the piping, different things that are very technical to that chlorine system, whereas an ammonia system is very different. Different types of construction, different types, so the exact knowledge is really critical to make sure that they're really able to assess that and to add value.
Okay, thank you. Also, in your testimony, you also raised concerns with the rule's safer technology alternatives analysis requirements. The rule requires a facility to conduct a STAA if it's within 1 mile of another facility with a 324 or 325 code. Do you believe this requirement does anything to improve safety?
We struggle to figure that one out, frankly. We have a hard time knowing what the other NEICS codes are of our adjacent facilities. I don't believe that there's been any rationale delivered for why the location matters. If there is something, we'd be glad to hear that.
Okay. Mr. Shaw, Mr. Drummond, would you agree with that assessment? Mr. Shaw, you may go for it. Thank you.
Yes, I would. It's difficult to know when we do our assessments to know what is surrounding that facility as far as commercial and industrial co-locators within any radius of the facility that we're looking at because of secrecy and proprietary information that many of these sites contain.
Okay. Mr. Drummond?
I would add simply that the SDA requirement does not illustrate any ability to reduce any risk, nor does it illustrate an ability to improve safety. It just simply adds a burden to the operator.
Okay. Thank you all very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Peters, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm a former environmental lawyer, no stranger to mitigating risk at sensitive sites while working to make sure that regulations are workable, complied with. I appreciate the sensitivity around this topic and can understand the balancing the needs of each individual site while maintaining public health and safety are critical and not necessarily easy. My main beef here is with this committee. I just want to remind people where we are. This rule is final. It's already the law. We didn't take it up any time before it came up. This is supposed to be the great legislative committee of the House of Representatives, and we are now talking about something that's already happened. We didn't take this up when the notice of proposed rulemaking came out, which probably was a year or two ago, to even get our comments into the record. This has already happened. And that annoys me because I was an environmental lawyer. Now I'm a legislator. I fought to get on this committee and on this subcommittee because I thought I had something to offer. But we waited until the rule was final to even take it up. So I apologize to you all for taking your time because we're now literally in a sideshow. This is like TV commentators sitting around talking about what already happened in probably one of the TV shows that would have the worst ratings ever. But this is a very technical thing. I think that we should be legislating. I think we should be doing it in a bipartisan way. And I just would observe that this is another one of those rules that if the administration changes, is going to be thrown out. And whatever good is in this rule, we will have lost. So here's my take on the issues, just for what it's worth, even though the rule is final, okay? I take what you say about risk, Mr. Shah. I understand that. What you're arguing, and Mr. Drummond arguing that generally under current law, we have a pretty good record. And that the risks are very small. I think that's a serious point. I take it. I think one place where I agree with you, I would agree with you, is the security concern. I think in many cases it might be more dangerous to have people know what's in there than have them not know what's in there, as long as the first responders have access to that information, which I believe under current law they do. We have something in California called Prop 65, which is it turned out to be ridiculous in practice. It requires the disclosure of when chemicals are at a site. So every restaurant you go into now, there's a little thing that says, we have chemicals on site that are known to cause cancer and damage to human health. They have cleaning solvents, right? Because they have to clean up the kitchen. And by the way, don't drink alcohol if you're pregnant, it's dangerous. That does not affect anyone's behavior anymore. We walk by those things, they're up there. If you don't have them up there, by the way, it's $2,500 a day for as many days as you miss it. But it is absolutely useless to affect the behavior of people. And I'm concerned, I feel also, I'm suspicious that letting people know these chemical compounds are in their neighborhood doesn't really do them any good, doesn't affect their behavior. I'm sympathetic on that. Here's where I think we may need updates. One is, I want to know about the ability to stop work. I think Mr. Savage makes a good point. If he's in a point where he knows the process, he can't stop the work, he feels intimidated. I think that's worth following up on. I want to know whether current law requires you to think about extreme weather, because I think weather has changed, and I think we should probably look at these rules and look at the law and make sure that it covers that. And I also want to know whether the remedies under current law are sufficient to provide the incentives for your folks to comply. What Mr. Savage said was that after this horrific thing that happened to him happened, they declared bankruptcy, and presumably, it's not good for the business, but maybe there's some remedies that would provide a better incentive against this kind of thing. I would like to take all those things up in a legislative hearing. I think we should probably do something legislative on this, Mr. Chairman. I can't believe we let the boat go by us, and we're talking about something that already happened. But that's where we are, and that's where we are in Congress too often. This is supposed to be where we have witnesses come in, testify about these things before we enact some regime of law or regulation that affects the American public. This is our job. And I'm disappointed that the majority didn't bring this to us sooner, because I think that the witnesses you brought in here raised some serious points. And I would love to have been part of deciding them. That's why I ran for Congress. That's why I brought an environmental law background here. I thought it would be useful. I'm sorry that this is behind us now. This has come when this law is already final. So now I assume it's in the courts. But I'll just offer to my colleagues and to the witnesses that if there's ways we can improve this regime, that's why I'm here. And like I said, I'm sympathetic on the security issues, but I think that there are some real issues that are raised by the rule that I think are worthy. It's just unfortunate that this committee's not the one making the law. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Iowa, Dr. Miller Meeks, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank our witnesses for testifying before the committee today. I also want to thank Representative Peters for his comments. Far too often, we find regulation that doesn't have its intended purpose, gets ignored, and I had the same thought that how many people move into an area and do not know that there is a water treatment facility or another facility using chemicals nearby. I think just as people are smart enough to look at what the school system is next to them, if there are electric lines overhead next to them, they're smart enough to know the businesses that are adjacent to their area. From providing essential materials for infrastructure and manufacturing to developing cutting-edge technologies that improve healthcare, my area, transportation, communication, chemicals play an incredibly vital role in everything we use daily. In Iowa, the chemicals industry is the second largest manufacturing industry in the state and generates over 5,000 jobs in my district alone. And I can't remember in 40 years that I've been in Iowa when there was the last chemical spill or accident, which are tragic when they happen, and we certainly want to both mitigate and prevent those. The final risk management programs rule put forth by the EPA puts unreasonable mandates on numerous industries for solutions, and as stated by the EPA on their website, and this is most important, only should benefit nearby communities. They actually don't even know why they updated or made the rule. That's very apparent in their comments, and I'm sorry to be so forthright in my criticism. Among other onerous mandates, this rule would require that some facilities conduct a safer technology and alternative assessment analysis. STA analysis. This analysis would be required as part of a process hazard analysis, PHA. The PHA is intended to identify, evaluate, and control the hazards involved in the process and requires owners and operators to use a team of experienced professionals to assess the hazards and possible outcomes. And let me just say, as a former military veteran and as a director of the Department of Public Health, we do these kind of trainings and exercises in communities all the time. Whether they're natural disasters, whether they're chemical disasters, whether they're train derailments, we do training. That's part of what you do with your EMA, emergency management associations. So, Mr. Erstad, in your experience conducting risk analyses, do you feel that the STA analysis provides valuable information to a facility, or do they typically identify risk mitigation measures that are already captured by other existing processes?
Well, we believe that we're doing a good job of controlling the risk through the current process. So, they're adding that level of, that additional analysis, that's, again, we're not sure we see the benefit there, because if things are, in the chlorine industry, there's well-established protocols, there are industry trade groups that come up with the right processes and procedures and vet things. And there is a concern that if we're going to be out there trying new, untried and unproven, new things we're doing in a plant, we are introducing new risks, and that concerns me.
And certainly, if you weren't mitigating risk now and trying to prevent things from occurring, would you have favorable location in a community next to residences?
Well,
would there not be protesters, perhaps?
Well, we try to locate in places where we don't have that, because we want to mitigate any potential effects.
So to mitigate risk, you're careful about location, you're also careful about working within the community to be able to prevent and mitigate risk should they occur.
And we want good relations with local first responders. We want people to be able to, come into our sites if there ever were an incident, and we want good relations with neighbors.
And do you have an estimate on how much it would cost your company to hire outside expertise to conduct a STA?
The rule is new enough. We haven't gone through all the way of getting quotes. I talked to one of our consultants who has helped us in some cases. He estimated it would take 2 to 3 times as long to do that with the safer technology assessment. So I can only imagine this is going to be significant.
And would that cost be passed on to customers and consumers nearby?
We are in the business to, make money, so yes, that would eventually be passed on.
And I can tell you in rural areas such as Southeast Iowa that I represent, and our senior citizens on fixed income, they cannot afford to have increased prices in their water and septic. So with that, I have a last question that I'm going to introduce for the record and ask you to respond after the hearing, and I yield back. Thank you.
The gentlelady yields. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from California, Representative Berrigan, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The EPA's final risk management program rule improves protections for workers, first responders, and communities that live near the 12,000 chemical facilities regulated by this rule. I'm proud to have advocated for this rule in a letter with Senator Cory Booker and 47 of my colleagues. The new safeguards are an important step for the safety of communities, especially in my district in Carson and Wilmington, California, that have refineries, and for San Pedro, which has a liquefied propane gas storage facility that residents have been concerned about for decades. Mr. Savage, my question is for you. The new EPA rule requires an analysis of safer technologies and alternatives at refineries that use hydrofluoric acid and the possible implementation of safeguard measures. Your testimony highlights how important this analysis can be. Thank goodness nobody was killed in the explosion at the Philadelphia refinery you worked at. Can you describe how important this requirement, can you describe how important this required safer alternatives analysis is for the safety of workers and communities at refineries?
Yes, thank you. And yes, thank goodness nobody was killed, but thank goodness nobody was killed. It's not a safety program. I struggle a little bit with the opposition to the safer technologies assessment, especially when it comes to hydrofluoric acid. It's the most dangerous substance used in the refining industry. It's the most dangerous process used in the refining industry. And if you're not constantly looking to see if you can do things safer or better, I don't understand it. I don't understand the opposition to it.
And can you talk about how the workers feel about having to work with this dangerous chemical?
I think that nobody's afraid of it. They respect it. They're well-trained. They're proud of the work they do. I think that they'd like to go home at night, though.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Mr. Savage. Last year, Republicans passed legislation in this committee that exempted refineries that use hydrofluoric acid from being required to do a hazard assessment or an assessment of safer technology options. One argument that they made is that there were not any safer alternatives to hydrofluoric acid. What's your response to that?
I think that, I remember that legislation, and the Steelworkers vigorously opposed that legislation. I think that there may not be, other than sulfuric acid, which is safer, but there are technology advances, and right now there's a refinery in Salt Lake City, I think, that's testing out another solid type of acid, and I think I don't know that it's on large enough scale to know if it's viable or not, but we would like to see the industry transition away from hydrofluoric acid when there is a reasonable alternative that's safer and commercially viable.
Well, thank you. We know that hydrofluoric acid is an extremely dangerous chemical. It's used by refineries, including in Torrance, California, near my district. In 2015, there was a near disaster at a refinery in Torrance, in my district, where debris from an explosion almost hit tanks with this dangerous chemical. And this could have been catastrophic for the community. And we know there are alternatives because in California, there's only a couple refineries still left using it. So we know there are alternatives. and there has to be a way to make sure that we are doing everything we can to protect not just the workers, but the community. So I thank you for being here today and for your work on this. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Allen, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chair Carter, for holding this important hearing to discuss the Environmental Protection Agency's rule on the risk management program. I also want to thank the witnesses for being here to testify on the implications of this rule. During this administration, we've seen aggressive rules coming out of the EPA that continue to hamstring several industries, especially those that deliver critical products for modern-day life. The Biden administration is yet again pushing a rule with onerous requirements for critical industries here in the U.S. I believe safety is paramount, but this rule does not consider what the covered industries under RMP are doing to ensure safety and mitigate risk. I come from the business world. I am far too familiar with burdensome regulations that have high compliance costs, which will ultimately be passed on to the consumer and makes us not competitive globally. This rule also has serious national security issues with the information sharing requirement, which I will get into. Additionally, in my district, there is a Hawkins water treatment facility that would be subject to this rule, and I'm glad to have Mr. Erstad here to discuss what this would do not only to this facility, but facilities across the industry. Mr. Erstad, in your opinion, how could the enhanced information disclosure be counterproductive to safety, especially at facilities such as agricultural retailers that only have 3 to 5 employees?
Well, I think that the information, we kind of talked about some of the challenges with knowing who to give the information to. I don't know a lot about the smaller ag retail facilities, but I did grow up in a small town in South Dakota, 380 people. I know people who are in that industry, and I know folks who, they're well-meaning, but there isn't exactly a staff to implement PSM projects.
Are EPA tools and guidelines for implementing this enhanced information disclosure sufficient to guide regulated facilities in its implementation?
No, I think that they're, for example, the spending significant time within 6 miles of the facility is not defined. What does that mean? How are we supposed to prove it? We have certainly seen bad actors out there trying to get access to information about our facilities. And if we're the ones that are the gate on this, and if we fail, that would be bad for the country and frankly, puts the neighbors at risk as well.
In your testimony, you raised valid concerns about security implications and administrative burdens that the rule's public information sharing requirements would place on regulated facilities, including yours. In your opinion, how could EPA have addressed this issue differently, making sure that communities have the information they need without creating massive administrative burdens and security vulnerabilities?
Well, I guess I go back to, I think that we've already had good relationships with our local first responders who are really the folks who need to know. We already have reporting obligations. We're reporting to the EPA the products that are on site. Information is certainly shared by the folks who we think need to know. There is information out there that's available to the public. I think that the concern is when you're getting into details about what processes we have, what we have implemented, what we have not implemented, and why, that's putting a lot of information potentially in the hands of people who could use it against this country.
In addition to these obvious security concerns with the rule's information sharing requirements, do you anticipate other unintended consequences?
Well, I think anytime you're putting a burden on an industry that is already burdened, and I talk a little bit from the chlorine perspective. The chlorine supply chain has been stressed lately. There have been shortages. I know when COVID hit, we had calls from public health officials across the country wanting to make sure they were going to have a supply of chlorine to be able to treat the water. We were able to get through that. There have been other shortages of the product, and there have been companies that have gotten out of that business. And if you get enough businesses out of that business, the supply will go down or be affected. That is a public health issue, and obviously any regulatory costs do get costs passed on to our customers and eventually on to the consumers.
So there would be severe consequences in health risk. Do you think there's a cost-benefit analysis being done here?
We don't necessarily see that, no.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for being with us today, and with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Skowski, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to talk to you, Mr. Savage. I am a union member myself, and we heard a lot about, cost benefit and, the harm that it's going to be doing to companies and somehow to the economy. I don't understand that. And I want to talk to you about that because about a year ago, just outside of my district, there was a chemical accident, and one of the workers was hospitalized. He had burns on his hands and on his head. Fortunately, this was not a fatal accident of this company in the district. But I really don't understand why we aren't arguing that we need more safety, not only for workers, but for communities, and that we don't embrace the idea of greater protections. And so that's really what I wanted to talk to you about. It seems to me that we could actually help companies, and it would be better for companies if there were fewer accidents. I can't see that it's a good thing for those companies who experience because of toxic chemicals that are in the workplace. Wouldn't there be an advantage economically for companies to diminish the number of accidents that occur?
Yes, thank you. I'm not aware of any incident or any reports ever of a refinery or a petrochemical facility shutting down because it was operating too safely. Healthy workers, uninjured workers are more productive workers. Across the board, we hear cost benefit, cost benefit. How about benefit? How about value? How about we value our employees? How about we value the communities that we work in? How about we care enough to secure their jobs and their lives while they're at work?
So what are the obligations of companies right now to, if any, to protect the workers? Is there anything in law right now that says that there are?
I mean, there's OSHA regulations, there's process safety management standard that I spoke about earlier. Certainly, I would never work in one of these plants without the protection of a collective bargaining agreement, though, because I don't feel like the laws go far enough. And it's a lot harder to enforce them when you don't have a union.
I also want to mention the impact on communities as well as workers. And we know that it falls most heavily, actually, on Black communities, which are more likely to be in communities where there are toxic spills or there are problems in the community. I just wondered if you wanted to comment not only on what happens to workers, but what happens to communities.
Sure. The aftermath of the explosions in Philadelphia left, there was bankruptcies, divorces. A couple of my former coworkers, unfortunately, have died from suicide. And we had a traumatized community that still sort of isn't over it, right? And the fact that some of these facilities negatively impact already marginalized communities more than others should be looked at and discussed.
Thank you. I agree. So I certainly think that we need more safety standards, that we need more training, and that we definitely can do better. And that's all that this rule would do. I think that's a good thing for all of us, and with that, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the chair of the full committee, the gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Rogers, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I mentioned in my opening statement, Americans are suffering from a record amount of regulations from this administration. Unelected, unaccountable agencies, boards, commissions, last year finalized 236 major regulations. We're on track this year for an additional 365 regulations, which, if adopted, add hundreds of billions of dollars in new costs to Americans and manufacturers and utilities and warehouses and anyone trying to do anything in America. According to the American Action Forum, as of April 19th, 2024, the Biden administration has finalized 851 major regulations costing $1.3 trillion. And they estimate 267 million new paperwork hours. And I just want to underscore, this is without any input or oversight by the elected representatives of the people. EPA has never been authorized by Congress. It needs to happen. Today, we're looking at just one of those regulations. So, Mr. Shah, I wanted to start with you. The final RMP rule uses the word ensure 107 times, including the changes to regulatory text and descriptions of intent. The D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals interprets the word ensure to mean to make sure or certain. If you're trying to prevent an accidental release, how much can you really ensure?
You can't.
Okay, so is it possible? Is it possible to eliminate all human error at an RMP facility?
Human error, we're all designed to fail. That's what our makers did, right? Our maker made us in a way that we all fail. There's a natural failure rate for humans, about 1 in 100,000 chances of failing. And the simple exercise of just eating your food, biting and chewing, during that time, about once every 100,000 operations, you bite your tongue. So what we do is we try to build in systems to help recover from that human error through mitigation measures and so on, provide layers of recovery from that, but you cannot eliminate human error.
Okay, thank you. Attorney General Drummond, one part of the final RMP rule that your state and others have vigorously objected to is the information sharing provisions. Almost 20 years ago, your state sadly learned the dangers of people having easy access to bomb-making materials. What are the security risks in requiring public disclosure across the routes to chemicals kept on site at RMP facilities? And what are the security risks in disclosing to perpetrators how a facility will try to mitigate nefarious actions?
Thank you. 29 years ago last month, we did suffer a devastating terrorist attack in Oklahoma, and it has put us on high alert ever since then. These rules offer a multitude of security risks requiring increased disclosure. And it's not clear that this will provide any additional benefit that offsets this risk. As I said in my opening statement, we have very few reportable incidents in the United States, and if this is accurate, then you would have to ask, why would it be important for anyone to have access to all of this sensitive information? There are sensitive and sufficient plans in place already with local emergency planning committees to expose our communities to the risk of a future terrorism attack is just untenable.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Erstad, in addition to the RMP rule, you have other regulatory requirements, new and existing, that your company must address in the near future. I just wanted you to, in the time remaining, discuss the impact of all these new regulations, including the Clean Water Act, Hazardous Substance Facility Response Plan, which you have on your company and industry.
Yeah, the workload has certainly increased. I think we're still digesting this rule. That Clean Water Act Hazardous Substance Facility Response Plan, aside from being a mouthful in itself, is going to be a lot for us to undertake, a lot of work again to go through. Again, the industry wants things to be safe. It doesn't do us any good to have injuries, to have disruptions to supply chain. Those are all bad things that we do everything we can to avoid, and we go above and beyond what the law requires in most cases. I think we talked before about this blanket approach being part of the problem. The good actors are going to be going to have to do almost more than what the bad actors are at this point.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. I'm frankly baffled at this line of questioning around the notion that because we can't eliminate 100% of human risk, that we shouldn't take these serious measures to mitigate risk, particularly in the circumstances that have been described today by Mr. Graves, Mr. Savage, rather. And so I'm disappointed. I'm not surprised, frankly, by the premise of the hearing, and I want to push back right away against the notion that this rule, the RMP rule, isn't necessary to prevent and respond to chemical accidents. It absolutely is necessary. It went through, there was a whole process of gathering up perspective and comment and input into it that led to the final rule, and it's there to protect people. It's the government's job, in this case, it's the EPA's job to mitigate potential risk that comes with manufacturing and protect both people and the environment from the often disastrous consequences when these chemical accidents do occur. One way for EPA to do that is to share basic information about the facilities and their risks with plant workers, the people that are actually there, first responders who are going to have to come in the case of an accident, the communities within the incident zone of a facility, so that they can be better prepared in the event of a disaster. And while the majority contends the revised RMP rule puts sensitive information at risk, the truth is that the disclosures it requires, like the chemicals stored on site, the accident history, the safety measures adopted, relate to information already publicly available to anyone with an ID and the means to get to an EPA reading room. Mr. Savage, just tell me, you've done it a number of times, but in what ways does having more information provided about a facility help to promote better safety decisions, either for workers in the plant or members of a nearby community?
Thank you. I think we've talked about this a little bit already, but obviously, to have an appropriate response to incidents, you need the more information you have, the more you can plan for your response. Certainly for workers, have the right to understand what they're working with. And members of the community absolutely have a right to understand what risks are in their communities, near their homes. It's difficult for me to understand how people think otherwise.
It's difficult for me to understand that too, because a better informed community, by definition, is going to be one where catastrophic events are less likely to occur in the first place, and one where the risk of harm will be reduced if an incident should arise. I worry that without this revised RMP rule, and again, going back to Mr. Peters' point, it's there, it's done. I don't quite understand the premise of this hearing, unless, frankly, it's to showcase an alarming insensitivity to communities and workers and so forth when it comes to the risks associated with these kinds of hazardous conditions. But what I worry about is that if you don't have this rule, if it's absent, if this kind of risk mitigation is absent, that the facilities wouldn't volunteer to engage in coordinated information sharing with first responders, workers, communities, or even undertake training activities to prepare people in the event of a disaster. I understand that. Your business, you're operating. It doesn't mean you're callous to the risk and safety. But you've got a set of priorities about operating the business and, yes, attending to the bottom line that may create blind spots for you as an organization when it comes to doing what's safe. That's why we have the EPA to come along and say, yes, as you're pursuing your business enterprise, these are things that we're going to make you focus on. We're going to eliminate blind spots when it comes to safety because it's in everybody's interest to do that, and you're going to have to figure out how to make it work. And in the long run, that's going to be better for everybody, for the company, for the workers, and for the surrounding communities. So I very much support the rule. Mr. Savage, I want to thank you for your very compelling testimony, and with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Pfluger, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just a quick response. I agree with what my colleague has said, that there's a reasonable way to move forward. But the fact is, the reason, let me just try to put a bow on this hearing, the reason we're having it is because we don't trust the EPA. We don't trust the decisions they're making to be reasonable in a way that actually solves the problem. So I'm just going to start out here. I'm trying to bite my tongue, Mr. Shah, as well, with my comments. But let me just start out and ask all four of you. I got a lot of questions, but is there a problem? Was there a problem that needed to be addressed, that this final rule addressed?
I would begin. The rules that preceded this illustrate that the process was working. I take exception with what Mr. Sarbanes characterized as companies tone deaf to the protection of its employees and the surrounding society. It already was happening. Yeah. The likelihood of an event is very small. And to remove all risk, then we need to all move to the middle of a cattle ranch in Oklahoma or Texas where we can drink water out of a well and ride our horse.
Mr. Shah, was there a problem? Does this final rule address said problem?
Thank you for that question. No, I don't think this rule is fixing any problem that the previous rules and the industry standards are already addressing.
Mr. Erstad.
I agree. I think we believe, based on the engineering practices of the industries have adopted, and the prior rule covered the bulk of what we've been talking about today.
Yeah, Mr. Savage.
I think that I don't know about a specific problem, but I would say that we should always strive for continuous improvement, and not everybody that operates facilities in these industries are as responsible as I'm sure these folks are. You put competitive pressure on responsible employers by letting irresponsible employers get away with things, right?
Yeah.
So we always support continuous improvement.
Yeah, I think that's the point, is that in a reasonable manner. This is yet another example, and y'all are testifying here, but this is one of 100 examples that we're going through with the EPA where it seems like it's unreasonable and there's overreach and they're not listening to industry. Mr. Shah, in your experience, do you believe, and I agree with Mr. Peters' comments, we should have had this hearing before the rule was made, but do you believe that industry was actually listened to, that their comments were taken into account?
Probably not.
Okay.
I'm sure they were listened to, but the second part.
Was action taken to
take action for it? I don't know if
their...
they actually followed through with what they heard. The example of the STA requirement to have to conduct that every 5 years, STAs are conducted by facilities. When they first look at building a plant or a facility, you look at all the different alternatives at that time, because that's the most practical time to look at it before you build something to see if there's anything that's safer. So it's very hard to retroactively implement something that is completely different, very expensive and very time-consuming.
What would you say, Mr. Erstad, is the trust level between industry, whether it's steel, whether it's refineries, anywhere, and the EPA as a result of this final rule?
Well, I think that you kind of asked a question about whether the EPA listened to industry. And I think there were some smaller things in the rule that were adjusted. But then I think there were a number of things that surprised us that came out of the blue. And they're the things we're actually talking about. So I think that there is a concern about the EPA, whether they're listening to us or not.
Thank you all for being here. In my previous career, I flew airplanes, which is inherently unsafe. And we did it in a manner in which we employed them in combat, which is even more unsafe. And from the years 2008 to 2016, under the Obama era, the regulations stacked up to over 6 feet tall. Heather Wilson, who was a former congresswoman, got to be the Secretary of the Air Force. She stacked them up, double-sided, 6 feet tall, and she told the 4-stars, cut them in half, because we were operating in a way that not only was no safer than it was in 2004, 5, 6, and 7 prior to the Obama era, but it was also extremely cumbersome, onerous, and less effective. I believe that this is another example, this rule, of doing something that may seem on paper to be good, but it actually isn't reflecting a safer work environment. Mr. Savage, agree with you. Continuous improvement is definitely needed. However, I think we've gone past some of the reasonable examples. I've gone over my time and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Erstad, in your written testimony, you mentioned concerns about the EPA information sharing requirement. You said that you were concerned that sharing information could put facilities at risk of being targeted by bad actors. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, I think that, first of all, I mentioned the EPA has the website up where they've got the GPS coordinates you can download of all of the facilities, which is a great concern for us. And, especially in light of the lapse of the chemical facilities anti-terrorism standards, we think the facilities are especially vulnerable right now, and that's something, those standards are things that the industry vigorously supported, and it's unfortunate they're not there. So I think when you couple that, and then you also get into we need to disclose all of this information about things that we haven't implemented, you are, again, exposing ourselves to people who could use that information for bad purposes.
Should be a particular concern to us, considering that the Biden administration has let millions of people across our borders, probably 1.6 million of whom are gotaways, another 500,000 or more that we don't even know about. And considering some of the nationalities, connections to known or suspected terrorist organizations, that should be very troubling to the American people that we're putting out information that could be used against us.
That's correct.
I got another question for you. You also mentioned the EPA expansion of audit requirements, and specifically, that the EPA requires external auditors to have certain credentials that place an extraordinary burden on the facilities. And yet, the EPA's updates don't consider the necessity of process-specific expertise. Prior to coming to Congress and prior to running a think tank for almost 25 years, I worked for 2 international engineering companies, and we built some pretty sophisticated facilities. I worked in environmental systems. I worked everything from refuse to energy to aerospace. And as someone who's worked in that environment now, not as a discipline engineer, but more of an overview of from the company perspective, I do understand how complicated these processes can be. Can you elaborate on how the EPA's changes to the auditing requirements affect your industry?
Well, again, if we have auditors who don't know the specifics of the materials compatibility, the various issues, and keeping up with the current standards, because I agree that continuous improvement is critical, and that's part of this review that we undertake already under the existing RMP process.
But it's also in the best interest of the company to continue these improvements, because you're not in the business to hurt people.
No, absolutely not. I mean, we want to send our employees home the same condition they came to work every day, and we want them to have a good job and a good life. And we want
you've made investments in the training of these people. And again,
Absolutely.
having worked in that environment,
Absolutely.
you don't just walk through the door one day and you're able to do this kind of work.
That's right.
You've made big investments, and particularly in the craft area. So you're in the business not only to make a profit, but to maintain a business for the long term.
That's right. That's right. It's not in our shareholders' best interest to have an incident happen.
I'm also, Mr. Shaw, interested in how industrial facilities are designed and how subsequent regulations may not align with the parameters of facilities design. The RPM rule requires that covered facilities implement at least one practicable passive measure or more similarly protective active measure, procedural measure on a 5-year cycle. Does the rule undermine the design of covered facilities and push really costly or impractical mitigation rather than addressing safety and decreasing risk?
So the facilities already have implemented many mitigation measures and procedural steps, training requirements in order to operate them safely. And that's why their safety record is so good to date. When you start looking at additional mitigation options, and these are always, you know, they are doing that on a periodic basis normally, but to have to document why you didn't implement a mitigation measure that wasn't practical,
Well,
that is
let me
where
ask it this way.
that could cause a chilling effect.
Who knows better how to mitigate risk, the design engineer or the EPA?
The design engineers and they versus the EPA, yeah, the design engineers.
And we've already established that a business is in business to stay in business, and so they have a built-in incentive to make sure that their designs mitigate risk and maximize safety.
Absolutely. Nobody wants anyone to get hurt, not their employees, not the community, and they want to send their people home safely every day.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I ask unanimous consent to insert in the record the documents included on the staff hearing documents list. Without objection, that will be the order. Gentlemen, thank you for being here today. I remind members that they have 10 business days to submit questions for the record, and I ask the witnesses to respond to the questions promptly. Without objection, the subcommittee is adjourned.